This is something that I have to talk about, and something we need to consider here. Hey guys, MasakoX here. Now this bonus discussion has come off of the back of a lot of things that have happened within the Dragonball series as of late. I've really been stewing on this. For the longest time, we had countless amounts of people consider Freeza to be one of the greatest villains with the entire Dragon Ball franchise, and that is for good cause. This guy was meant to be a bad guy, as stated by Toriyama countless times. I mean, I'm not talking about this specific one because this is really cute, like a Kirby Freeza model that I was given to at Kumicon by Spectral Beanie on Instagram. Do check out his stuff. But all of that being said, he has recently been shown to have matured or shown some more ability to tolerate the Dragon Team in various guises and scenarios. Well, why is that? So what do we mean by the title of this video? Well, I'm being very blunt here, in that Frieza is by no means a hero. He never will be. Even in my What If Frieza Turned Good scenario, which you should check out as well, he's not going to be going down that kind of avenue. There is something intrinsically menacing about this guy which will not go away. He was meant to be the creation of King Cold as the definition of a supreme ruler and pure chaos. But has that role within the show been taken away from him? Well, I think so. Kid Buu is pure chaos, so that accolade and plum will never be topped for sure, and I think even Frieza knows that, as he is aware of Majin Buu to some extent, even though he and his father mostly thought of that as a legend. And what with that as Super Saiyans, those Cold members were certainly superstitious now that you think about it. Nor do I think that Frieza is a pure villain anymore. In fact, in most types of fiction, this is something I studied in basic film studies when I was in college, those kinds of characters don't exist. Or if they do exist, they are very wooden and one-dimensional. They don't last the test of time. I can think of one example from an episode of a recent Doctor Who, the one with the golf club, where the owner of it is completely remorseless, and as a result of that, his character was panned for being unrealistic somewhat. I mean, the actor's great, but you can only do so much. I can sort of agree with what people think from a writing point of view. But at the other end of the spectrum, there is a series Good Omens by Neil Gaiman, and this captures the balance between good and evil perfectly. Sometimes good people do questionable things, and sometimes bad people act in a redeeming manner. There is no black or white at play here, there's just constant grey. Characters are very nuanced, and Frieza is certainly very nuanced. So let's go back to the origins of this character from Toriyama's perspective. In my video from way back in 2017, it's actually one of my favourites, I talked about the reason that Frieza came into existence in the first place, and that was purely out of spite from the late 80s and early 90s housing bubble within Japan. Akira Toriyama has also stated many times that Frieza's personality and appearance are modelled on things that he personally believed to be frightening to him when he was younger, and actually even to this day. His horned head, his exoskeleton, reptile-like features are enough to instill a feeling of foreboding and fear in most of us. But of course, yeah, okay, we can see elements from different sci-fi beings in Frieza's transformations. Well, I mean, see, it's obvious. But go back to the housing thing, a huge housing bubble arose where prices increased dramatically and land sharks were common, driving up the value of land and selling it on to the highest bidder. Does that remind you of anyone? Only with planets instead of simple property? Frieza was the manifestation of Toriyama's resentment for these kind of people. Toriyama wasn't the only one. Toriyama was doing what most of the Japanese populace thought. Instead of festering internally, he put pen to paper and drew up this now legendary character. Here's his quote that sums up his thought perfectly. "I'm not good with drawing truly bad guys. I guess it's just probably Frieza, like he was truly a bad guy. The others all have an aspect that you can't hate remaining somewhere in there." So it seems that before now, Toriyama had struggled with making really villainous personalities, but there was something about Frieza which managed to focus his mind onto his goal of making a truly iconic villain. He succeeded, and has made a character which has lasted the test of time. As has, unfortunately, the legacy of his inspiration, which Japan is still dealing with to this day. That housing bubble? Yeah, it kind of burst in 1992, and that said about the economic recession to which the after effects remain in place in modern day Japan, in some regard. But in Dragon Ball Super, I think he's evolved into something more than that. It was a very sudden change in a way, because in his Resurrection F guise, he was just the same old Freezy Pop that we all knew, and even though it was kinda cool to see, it didn't exactly make for a lasting movie which could be revisited time and time again, nor is it memorable in any other way. I mean, at least with Broly's Second Coming, that could instill feelings of surrealness and interest to some extent where you go like, what? What the heck? What? The incredulity, you remember that. Whereas I can't go back to Resurrection F anymore because it's just, to me, so boring now. Even the super arc of it's pretty bland, and it's certainly not helped when it comes to the visuals, but that's for another time. But what I'm getting at here is the period of time that Frieza spent on himself after that arc. Down in his own personal tomb, he had a moment of clarity, something which resonated with him, and since the Tournament of Power saga, we have witnessed a sense of maturity in his character, and this was brought into very sharp relief during the Dragon Ball Super Broly movie. Has Frieza finally grown up? You see, in that movie, we see two different Friezas at play. The first one we witness is the very young, newly crowned ruler of the Cold Force, renaming it the Frieza Force. You can immediately tell he is a little up himself. Actually, a lot up himself. To us at that time, at the very least, he is a neutral evil character, because he is doing all of this for his own personal gain, instead of doing it just for the heck of it, which would then class him as some kind of chaotic evil character, which is what King Cold would have liked to have seen in some way. But therein lies a problem with his logic, and something that King Cold didn't consider. If he wanted to create a truly perfect offspring, evil incarnate and pure chaos, then the mechanics of the monarchy would have been overridden, and as such, the monarchy would have ceased to exist. So, therein creates a paradox which King Cold would have never managed. It would have all been absolutely fruitless. We see Frieza at his most unpredictable then, as a young creation, not even with his trademark armor yet. Fast forward to the present day, and we see Frieza more assured of himself. And I think that has something to do with the onset of aging. I've witnessed this myself. Back when I was at university in my early 20s, I felt very unsure of myself. Like, I didn't know what I was like and what I was going to turn out as. But now in my now approaching mid-30s, I now feel more assured of myself. I know what I'm like, I know what I can do, I feel like I have experience. And that has now happened to Frieza. In the Broly movie, and even in the Universe Survival arc, we see a Frieza who's more chilled and relaxed with his lot in life. He is even able to take a joke and be the butt of one with the likes of Berry Blue. The very fact that he could jest with his subordinates like that is a very remarkable change, and actually shows that the writers of the show are able to do what Toriyama failed to do for the longest time. And as well as the likes of the Resurrection F director Tadayoshi Yamamuro, they could not encapsulate this. Empathy and the rounding out of a character. We'll get on to more of that shortly, but let's go back to Broly and the Tournament of Power for a second. In both of these stories, Frieza has to cooperate with the likes of Goku, his arch nemesis. And before recent outings of Dragon Ball, Frieza would have never aligned himself with that monkey for anything. But since he's now focused his powers and achieved his true golden form, he has done an about-face, and realised that he is sort of codependent with this Saiyan. Goku gives him life almost, and from there, we start to see elements of Frieza's personality change that we've never seen before happen. And thusly, we start to see him in a different light, and feel things that we hadn't done back in the days of the Namek saga, when he was meant to be essentially a simple baddie. In fact, the likes of Lemmo and some of the other Frieza Force members now actually remark that Frieza has changed in a way, in that back in the day, he would have just destroyed people if they dared question him even slightly. But now, it's all different. He's now rounded out. It's quite refreshing and a very notable change of pace for all concerned. It was also rather necessary. I remember and was part of the noise that pushed back at Frieza's resumption in the story for a third time. But the writers were able to pull it off by showing a different side to Frieza, one who could cooperate to a point, and even showed tinges of respect for the likes of Gohan, and acknowledging things beyond his control, and even proved to be useful to our heroes. Now let's get back to the rounding out of the character some more. In this thesis that I found from Asbjørn Havitfred Andersen, he is talking about the concept of heroes and villains in American cinema. Now, I hear you cry, wait a minute, Toriyama's Japanese, this wouldn't apply. Yes, you are correct, but Toriyama was very heavily influenced by American cinema, having confessed to being a huge fan of Hollywood and science fiction movies, so I do think that this thesis is very much adequate. Where the villains have the most powerful imagery and condensed alignment attached to them, the heroes are much more in focus in terms of spatio-temporal alignment, and therefore receive the majority of screen time. The narratives are presented through the gaze of their subjective experiences of the plot progression, but the villains are meticulously emphasized through the condensation of their individual representations. The eloquent construction of allegiance for the hero characters is sometimes equal to, but never greater than, the allegiance for the villains. What this boils down to is that we rarely see the villains develop as we see heroes develop. It's all about them, no matter the medium, the heroes. However, I feel that more in recent Dragon Ball series, we're starting to see the villains develop more, and thusly, we are getting a much bigger interpretation of them. We are starting to see them being more equal. In more recent series, we see Vegeta, originally an evil character, blossom into a much more accomplished individual, even though in Super it's more of just a repeat of what we saw in Z. But now, we are starting to get that with Frieza, and seeing him mature as he grows older. He is at least 60 years old, if not older, and perhaps he's starting to act like his father in seeing the bigger picture. King Cold wasn't a nice person, don't get me wrong, but he knew the value of his subjects, and if they aided his empire, he would reward them and respect them, like what he did with King Vegeta III and his people. They were useful. Frieza didn't see that originally, and instead just wanted to blindly assert his dominance. Now though, with hindsight, he can see what his father saw in the Saiyans, and so he will work with them when the need arises. That is a huge deal for Frieza, and this sets him down the roads towards veering away from becoming a clone of his old self. That version of him is gone, and as such, he is becoming much more of an enigma. So, let's try and answer the question of the video. Is Frieza an anti-hero or an anti-villain? Well, in my personal belief, he is more aligned to an anti-villain. He is not going to be the main focus of an arc anymore. He's had that, his time has passed. At the very least, he might be the instigator of an arc, but then come to the aid of the heroes. He is a very marketable character, so keeping him around is very much worth it. And so going with what Anderson said in the earlier quote, the added screen time will allow us to see more of Frieza because he's interacting with the heroes instead of going against them. He will organically evolve into a more redeemable character, or at least one we could understand better. An anti-villain is a lesser villain, one that has mellowed out or lightened up, like with how Vegeta, he's a good example of that, but he's also a good example of then evolving into an anti-hero, a hero with darker traits. You could actually lump Goku into that in a way, but, you know, it's a bit iffy there. But Frieza has certainly lightened up. He is not an anti-hero. He may have helped in the Tournament of Power, but we have to remember, that was more for his own personal benefit, in that he got granted life again, but at least he was able to work with our heroes. But since then he has had room to grow, so you never know what may happen in order to keep him relevant in Dragon Ball in 2020 and onwards. So what do you guys think? Do you think Frieza is still a villain, or has he become more than that? Leave a comment below and let's get this discussion going, and I shall see you in the next video. Catch you later!